June 6, 1944, 5 o'clock in the morning, Crisbecq Battery, Normandy coast. The binoculars trembled slightly as Oberleutnant See Walter Ohmsen swept them across the horizon, recording in his mind an image that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Through the pre-dawn gloom, he witnessed something that contradicted every assurance from the German High Command. The English Channel, that protective moat that had shielded the Third Reich's western flank, had transformed into a steel highway. An endless armada stretched from horizon to horizon, their dark silhouettes merging into one continuous mass of approaching doom. The invasion force comprised 6,939 vessels, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 ancillary craft, 864 merchant vessels manned by over 195,000 naval personnel from 8 Allied countries. At 5:52 in the morning, Ohmsen's battery received the order to open fire. 3 minutes later, at 5:55, the first shells from his 210mm Czech-made Skoda cannons arced toward the invasion fleet, drops of water against an approaching tsunami. From his reinforced concrete observation post atop the Crisbecq Battery, the 32-year-old naval officer had just become the first German defender to sight and engage the Allied invasion of Fortress Europe. What Ohmsen saw through his Zeiss rangefinder that morning was not just an invasion fleet. It was the physical manifestation of an industrial capacity that Nazi propaganda had assured him could not exist. The mathematics of defeat were sailing toward him at 8 knots. The transformation had begun. Within hours, German officers across Normandy would witness a demonstration of Allied industrial might that would shatter every assumption about their enemy's capabilities and mark the beginning of the end for Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. The darkness of June 5th had brought ominous signs, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared the German defenders for what they were about to face. Not a battle of soldiers, an industrial avalanche that would rewrite the rules of modern warfare forever. His battery engaged the U.S. cruisers USS Tuscaloosa and USS Quincy and the battleship USS Nevada. At 6:30 in the morning, his guns would claim the destroyer USS Corrie, the only U.S. destroyer lost on D-Day. From the impact of those first shells, leaving the barrels to the distant plumes of water erupting near the massive fleet, Ohmsen understood a fundamental truth that Nazi propaganda had concealed. This was not a raid. This was not a feint. This was the physical manifestation of industrial capacity on a scale that defied German comprehension. But Ohmsen was not the only observer witnessing the impossible that morning. 50 miles inland at Army Group B headquarters in La Roche-Guyon, Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel since April 15, 1944, monitored increasingly disturbing reports throughout the night. Rommel himself was absent in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday, convinced the weather was too poor for any invasion attempt. At 1:20 in the morning, the 7th Army received notification of massive parachute drops across Normandy. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, numbering over 13,000 men, were being delivered by Douglas C-47 Sky trains. These were not scattered reconnaissance teams. This was an airborne army dropping from the sky. General der Artillerie Erich Marcks, commanding the 84th Corps from his headquarters in Saint-Lô, understood immediately. A veteran of the Eastern Front who had lost a leg at Stalingrad, Marcks possessed the tactical instinct that years of combat had honed to a razor's edge. When the reports of airborne landings reached his desk, he did not wait for confirmation from higher command. He knew. Yet even Marcks, one of the Wehrmacht's most experienced commanders, could not imagine the scale of what was approaching. The German defenders had prepared for an invasion. They had not prepared for an industrial avalanche that would bury them under sheer material superiority. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, appointed as naval advisor to Rommel in November 1943, had spent months inspecting the coastal defenses. Born into a naval family in 1894, Ruge understood maritime operations better than any German officer in France. He had pressed for more mines, more obstacles, more guns. But as he would later write in his memoir, Rommel in Normandy, they were preparing to fight the last war while the Allies were bringing the next one. The German High Command had convinced itself that the Allies could mount an invasion with perhaps 20 divisions supported by maybe 3,000 vessels. They based these calculations on their own capabilities, their own limitations, their own experience of scarcity and increasing industrial exhaustion after 5 years of war. As the first light of dawn crept across the Normandy coast on June 6th, German observers in bunkers and observation posts from Cherbourg to Le Havre began reporting the impossible. Not hundreds of ships, but thousands. Not a raid or a feint, but the largest amphibious invasion in human history. At Strong Point WN-62, overlooking what would become known as Omaha Beach, Gefreiter Heinrich Severloh peered through his machine gun embrasure at 5:45 in the morning. The 20-year-old farm boy from Metzingen had never seen the ocean before being stationed in Normandy. Now he saw no ocean at all, only steel. Ships everywhere, big ships, small ships, fat ships with flat bottoms, destroyers racing back and forth like sheepdogs. The horizon was gone, replaced by an endless wall of grey metal. He tried to count, but gave up at 100. There were thousands, and they were all coming toward him. At 5:30 in the morning, the naval bombardment commenced. The statistics alone told the story of what German defenders were about to face. Available to the fleet were 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 2 monitors. For the German defenders, it was their first lesson in American industrial mathematics. The USS Texas alone fired 255 rounds from her 14-inch guns in the first hour. Each shell weighed 1,400 pounds. In 60 minutes, one ship had delivered 178 tons of high explosives, more than many German artillery regiments possessed in total ammunition reserves. Before the first soldier set foot on the beaches, before the first landing craft touched sand, the Allied naval forces had fired approximately 50,000 shells from destroyers, 23,000 shells from cruisers, and 3,500 shells from battleships. Roughly 130,000 tons of explosive ordnance had been hurled at the Atlantic Wall. The concrete bunkers that German engineers had spent years constructing were being systematically pulverized by a weight of fire that exceeded anything seen in previous amphibious operations. Each gun emplacement, each observation post, each strong point had been identified, catalogued, and assigned to specific ships whose crews had practiced on these exact targets using aerial photographs and detailed intelligence reports. General der Infanterie Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Commander-in-Chief West, would later testify in captured interrogations that fundamentally changed his understanding of modern warfare. "We had prepared to fight soldiers," he stated. "We found ourselves fighting factories." The distinction was not merely semantic. It represented a philosophical shift in how war was conducted. German officers had trained in traditions of military excellence, tactical brilliance, and individual courage. They discovered that industrial capacity had rendered these virtues secondary to production capacity, but the naval bombardment was only the first demonstration of Allied material superiority. At 6 o'clock in the morning, as naval shells continued to pulverize the Atlantic Wall, German defenders witnessed the second demonstration that would define their defeat. The sky filled with aircraft, not dozens or hundreds, but thousands. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties in support of the landings, having secured air supremacy through months of systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe prior to the invasion. The German Air Force had approximately 300 operational aircraft in all of France. On D-Day, they managed 319 sorties. The Allies flew 14,674. For every German plane in the air, there were 46 Allied aircraft. The mathematics were not just unfavorable, they were absurd. Major Josef Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, made the only Luftwaffe attack on the invasion beaches that morning. With just his wingman Heinz Wodarczyk, he strafed Sword Beach once before fleeing from dozens of Allied fighters. This famous incident, documented in multiple historical accounts, demonstrated the complete impotence of German air power. 2 pilots against an invasion fleet of 7,000 ships. 2 fighters against 14,000 Allied aircraft. It was not a battle. It was a symbol of Germany's complete inability to contest Allied control of the skies. German soldiers who had fought in Russia, who had survived the Eastern Front's brutal combat, reported that Normandy was different. In Russia, they at least occasionally saw German aircraft. In Normandy, the sky belonged entirely to the enemy. Every vehicle that moved in daylight became a target. Every troop concentration was spotted and bombed. Every supply column was strafed. The Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe in 1940, had been reduced to irrelevance by Allied industrial production and systematic attrition. Despite the overwhelming firepower arrayed against them, German defenders at certain positions initially believed they might hold. At Omaha Beach, the 352nd Infantry Division occupied excellent defensive positions on bluffs overlooking the beach. Machine guns in concrete bunkers created interlocking fields of fire. Months of preparation had turned the beach into a killing zone. The first waves of American infantry from the 1st and 29th Divisions walked into a slaughter. From the moment the Americans hit the beach at 6:30 in the morning, machine gun fire erupted from the resistance nests. Heinrich Severloh, manning an MG-42 machine gun at Widerstands Nest 62, fired over 12,000 rounds that morning, a documented fact from his own testimony recorded decades later. He watched American soldiers fall by the dozens, by the hundreds. Bodies floated in the surf. The beach turned red with blood. The carefully planned invasion timetable collapsed within minutes. Tanks drowned in the rough surf. Landing craft were destroyed before reaching shore. Officers were cut down leading their men. For 2 hours, Omaha Beach appeared to be an American catastrophe. From his position, Severloh could see the entire beach. Bodies piled up at the waterline. Men huddled behind beach obstacles, unable to advance, unable to retreat. The bluffs above the beach remained firmly in German hands. For a brief moment, it seemed the Atlantic Wall might hold. German propaganda's promises of Fortress Europe appeared vindicated. The Americans, despite their numbers and their ships, were dying on the beach. Then the destroyers came. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, with the situation on Omaha Beach critical and General Omar Bradley seriously considering evacuation of the beachhead, something unprecedented occurred. American destroyers, ignoring the risk of grounding or mines, closed to within 1,000 yards of the beach. Point-blank range for naval guns, the USS McCook, USS Carmick, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt turned their 5-inch guns on individual German strongpoints. At such range, they couldn't miss. Shells weighing 54 pounds began impacting bunkers with devastating accuracy. The reinforced concrete that had protected German gun positions shattered under direct fire from naval rifles. Observation posts disappeared in explosions. Machine gun nests were obliterated. The German defenders experienced something that no amount of training had prepared them for. This action, well documented in naval records and post-war analysis, proved decisive in breaking the German defense at Omaha. But more than the tactical success, this moment revealed something profound about American industrial warfare. This was the moment German officers began to understand the true meaning of American industrial might. It wasn't just the number of ships. It was the willingness to risk them, to use them as expendable assets in support of ground troops. The destroyer USS Corrie had been lost earlier that morning to Ohmsen's guns at Crisbecq Battery, but immediately other destroyers took its place. There was no pause, no recalculation of strategy, no hesitation. The loss of one destroyer among thousands did not alter American plans by a single minute. Ships were not precious, irreplaceable assets as they were for the Kriegsmarine. They were tools, weapons platforms that could be risked, even sacrificed, because America had thousands more. The naval officer who ordered his destroyer to within 1,000 yards of a fortified beach was not being reckless. He was following doctrine based on abundance. If his ship ran aground, another would replace it. If his ship struck a mine, the mission would continue. This was industrial warfare at its essence. Not careful husbanding of limited resources, but aggressive employment of overwhelming material superiority. German defenders who had been killing Americans by the hundreds suddenly found themselves the targets of naval guns that could punch through concrete and steel. The psychological impact was devastating. Severloh, who had fired 12,000 rounds and killed dozens, possibly hundreds of American soldiers, watched helplessly as his bunker walls cracked under naval bombardment. The confidence of holding Omaha Beach evaporated as surely as the concrete fortifications were being pulverized by 5-inch shells. As the morning progressed, German observers witnessed something that defied their understanding of amphibious operations. The landing craft kept coming, wave after wave, hour after hour, an endless conveyor belt of men and material flowing from sea to shore. This was not the desperate rush of an invading force trying to establish a precarious foothold. This was systematic industrial deployment of military power. The variety of specialized vessels stunned German observers who had trained on doctrine assuming limited Allied amphibious capability. Landing craft tank, known as LCTs, disgorged 30-ton Sherman tanks directly onto the beaches. These massive vessels, each capable of carrying multiple tanks, beached themselves, opened bow doors, and delivered armor directly into combat. Landing ship tanks, or LSTs, massive vessels 328 feet long, beached themselves and opened bow doors to discharge entire tank companies. UKW amphibious trucks swam ashore, drove up the beach, and delivered supplies directly to combat units without requiring port facilities. Each of these vessels represented engineering solutions to logistical problems that German planners considered unsolvable without capturing port facilities. The Allies had simply engineered their way around requirements that German doctrine considered absolute. By nightfall of the first day, the Allies had landed approximately 156,000 troops, 132,715 by sea, and 23,400 airborne. This force exceeded the entire German 7th Army defending Normandy. In the first 24 hours, the documented Allied achievement included 156,000 personnel, 20,000 vehicles, 1,700 tanks, and 15,000 tons of supplies. The German 7th Army, defending the entire Normandy region, possessed fewer than 500 operational tanks. The Allies landed 3 times that many on the first day. The mathematical disparity was staggering. More vehicles landed on D-Day than the entire German army in France possessed. More supplies delivered in one day than German logistics could distribute in a week. The German response to the invasion revealed not just material inferiority, but systemic breakdown in the face of overwhelming enemy capability. The legendary Panzer divisions, which had conquered France in 6 weeks in 1940, found themselves paralyzed by Allied air supremacy and naval gunfire. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit close enough to intervene on D-Day, began its counterattack at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The division took 3 full hours to move the 10 miles from Chiron to Sword Beach. What should have been a devastating armored thrust became a tragic procession of burning vehicles. Allied fighter bombers, operating in cab ranks controlled by forward observers, struck every vehicle that moved. When the surviving panzers finally engaged British forces near Sword Beach, they encountered naval gunfire directed by forward observers. With radio communications to ships lying 15 miles offshore, HMS Warspite, monitoring from international waters, fired 15-inch shells that could penetrate any tank ever built. Each shell weighed 1,900 pounds. A single hit didn't just destroy a tank, it obliterated it, leaving nothing but a crater and scattered metal fragments. SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer, commanding the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, would later write in his memoirs a sentence that captured German frustration perfectly. The enemy's material superiority was so great that our own strength was swept away like a wave breaking on a rock. This was not the language of soldiers discussing tactical defeat. This was the testimony of men who had witnessed something beyond their conceptual framework. Meyer had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He had commanded elite SS troops considered the finest soldiers Germany produced. Yet in Normandy, his regiment's excellence was rendered irrelevant by industrial superiority, so overwhelming that courage and skill became secondary factors. Throughout the Normandy campaign, German movement in daylight had become virtually impossible. Any vehicle, any troop formation, any supply column that appeared in open ground became an immediate target for Allied aircraft that appeared within minutes. On June 7th, D-Day +1, German reconnaissance aircraft brought back photographs that senior officers initially refused to believe. The Allies were building harbors, not capturing ports as German defensive strategy anticipated, but building them from nothing in the open sea. The Mulberry harbors represented industrial capability on a scale that challenged comprehension. Prefabricated in Britain, these artificial ports consisted of 600,000 tons of concrete, 33 jetties, 10 miles of floating roadways, and 93 ships deliberately sunk as breakwaters. Within 2 weeks, the Mulberry harbors were handling 9,000 tons of supplies daily, more than many established French ports could process. The Germans had spent 4 years building the Atlantic Wall to protect the ports, operating under the assumption that invading forces would require existing port facilities to sustain operations. The Allies had simply eliminated the requirement for ports through industrial engineering. They had solved a strategic problem not through military brilliance, but through manufacturing capacity. The concrete caissons that formed the harbour breakwaters had been constructed in British shipyards, towed across the English Channel, and sunk in predetermined positions. The floating roadways that connected ships to shore had been designed, tested, and mass-produced. Every component of these artificial harbors represented industrial problem-solving on a massive scale. Throughout June 1944, German commanders gradually realized the completeness of their intelligence failure. The elaborate deception of Operation Fortitude had convinced German intelligence that the Normandy landings were a feint. The real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, led by Patton's fictitious 1st United States Army Group. For crucial weeks, German reserves remained frozen, waiting for an invasion that never came. General der Panzertruppen Leo Freiherr Geier von Schweppenburg, commanding Panzergruppe West, discovered the deception when captured documents revealed Patton's actual location in Normandy, commanding the very real Third Army. The psychological impact of this revelation was profound. Not only were German forces being overwhelmed by material superiority, but their intelligence services had been completely deceived about Allied intentions and capabilities. But the true measure of Allied industrial dominance became clear when comparing production figures. The numbers told a story of mathematical impossibility for German victory. In 1944, German aircraft production reached 39,807 planes. American production that same year was 96,000 aircraft. Germany's peak monthly tank production was 1,854 vehicles in December 1944. America produced 29,000 tanks in all of 1944. German military truck production for the entire year was 68,000 vehicles. America produced 650,000 military trucks in the same period. These statistics didn't include British, Canadian, or Soviet production. Germany was fighting the entire world's industrial output, with the production capacity of a medium-sized nation increasingly reduced by strategic bombing. Total American wartime production included staggering numbers that redefined industrial warfare: 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 2 million army trucks, 41 billion rounds of ammunition. General Franz Halder, former chief of the General Staff, calculated after the war that by 1944, The Allied advantage in war production was approximately 5-1. In certain categories, like trucks, it was 10-1. His conclusion was stark and mathematically precise. We were not defeated, we were mathematically eliminated. The German officers who survived Normandy were psychologically transformed by what they witnessed. They had been raised under Nazi ideology that proclaimed German racial and cultural superiority. They had been assured that Americans were soft, spoiled by luxury, incapable of matching German military excellence. Instead, they discovered Americans had machines to do the hard work, radios that actually functioned to coordinate operations, abundant ammunition to practice with until achieving proficiency, and confidence born from unlimited support. Every American soldier knew that if his rifle jammed, another would be provided. If his vehicle broke down, another would replace it. If he was wounded, medical care was available. If he was killed, more soldiers would arrive to continue the mission. This was not arrogance. It was the practical confidence of men backed by the world's largest industrial economy, fully mobilized for war. German soldiers had fought with courage and skill throughout Normandy. But courage without ammunition is helplessness. Skill without supplies is irrelevant. Excellence without support is suicide. The final statistics from the Normandy campaign told the comprehensive story of industrial warfare's decisive victory over traditional military excellence. From June 6th to August 30th, 1944, the Allied achievement exceeded anything previously attempted in military history. 2,052,299 personnel landed on the Normandy beaches and pushed inland. 438,471 vehicles were brought ashore, ranging from motorcycles to heavy tanks. 3,098,259 tons of supplies sustained operations for nearly 3 months of continuous combat. Allied aircraft flew over 480,000 sorties, maintaining complete air supremacy throughout the campaign. German losses in Normandy approached catastrophic levels. 240,000 killed, 200,000 captured, 2,200 tanks and assault guns destroyed. Over 40 divisions effectively eliminated as fighting units. These were not just numbers. Each represented a unit that could never be replaced. Soldiers whose training and experience was irreplaceable. Equipment that German industry could no longer manufacture in sufficient quantities. The German army that retreated from Normandy was fundamentally broken. Not just tactically defeated, but structurally destroyed beyond reconstitution. In 1954, 10 years after D-Day, surviving German officers gathered in Bonn for a private symposium on the Normandy campaign. General der Infanterie Günther Blumentritt, who had served as Chief of Staff to both Rundstedt and Kluge, delivered the keynote address. His words captured the transformation that witnessing Normandy had wrought on German military thinking. We learned in Normandy that war had changed fundamentally. It was no longer a contest of armies, but of economic systems. We counted divisions while they counted factories. We measured courage while they measured production. The image that haunts me still is the sight of American bulldozers pushing aside our destroyed tanks to clear roads for their supply. Trucks. The German officers who witnessed D-Day were permanently transformed by the experience. Hans Speidel became a NATO general, helping integrate West Germany into the Western Alliance. Many Normandy veterans became advocates for European economic integration, understanding that only by pooling resources could European nations hope to match American industrial capacity. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded German forces in Italy, compared his experience with those who fought in Normandy. In Italy, he noted, German forces could fight the Allies on relatively equal terms. In Normandy, on open ground where the Allies could deploy their full industrial might, German forces were simply erased. On June 6, 1984, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Walter Ohmsen returned to Crisbecq Battery as an honored guest. The former Oberleutnant zur See, now 73 years old, stood at the same observation post where he had first sighted the invasion fleet 4 decades earlier. Speaking to gathered veterans, both Allied and German, he reflected on what he had witnessed that morning and what it meant. 40 years ago, I stood here and saw the impossible possible, a sea covered with ships from horizon to horizon. I knew in that moment that everything I had been told was wrong. Weak nations don't build 7,000 ships. Divided nations don't coordinate such an invasion. I fired my guns at that armada, and I might as well have been throwing stones at the tide. We sank one destroyer, damaged a few others. For every ship we hit, 100 passed unharmed. His words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Young officers today study tactics from Normandy. But the real lesson is simpler. In modern war, the side that can produce the most wins. We learned that industrial capacity is military capacity. The sea of ships I saw that morning was not just an invasion fleet. It was American industrial might made visible. The German officers who watched nearly 7,000 Allied ships approach on D-Day witnessed more than an invasion. They witnessed the future of warfare, where industrial capacity would trump every other consideration. The image that haunted them, that impossible armada stretching from horizon to horizon, was the physical manifestation of democracy's latent power unleashed, of industrial might applied to military purpose on a scale that rendered traditional military virtues insufficient. They had prepared for war. They met instead the full industrial capacity of the United States, supported by the combined production of Britain, Canada, and eventually the arsenal of democracy's complete mobilization. Their defeat was not military but mathematical, not tactical but industrial, not a failure of courage but a shortage of trucks, of ammunition, of fuel, of replacement parts, of everything required to sustain modern military operations. It was a lesson written in steel across the waters of the English Channel on June 6, 1944, when nearly 7,000 ships announced that American industrial might had come to Europe and nothing would ever be the same again. The lessons of June 6, 1944 extend far beyond military history. They speak to the power of industrial democracies when fully mobilized, to the importance of alliance and coordination, and to the fundamental truth that material resources matter as much as courage in modern conflict. The 7,000 ships that Walter Ohmsen saw through his binoculars that morning represented more than naval power. They represented the collective will of free nations choosing to confront tyranny with the full weight of their industrial capacity. These stories survive because men like Ohmsen, Severloh, Speidel, and countless others chose to share their experiences, even when those memories were painful. Their testimonies, preserved in archives and memoirs, allow us to understand not just what happened, but what it meant to those who lived through it. By examining these accounts, by studying the documented evidence, we ensure that the lessons of D-Day remain relevant for generations facing their own challenges. The mathematics of that day were clear. The moral mathematics were equally so. When industrial capacity serves the cause of freedom, when democracies unite their resources toward common purpose, the result is not merely military victory, but the preservation of values worth defending. That remains true today as it was 81 years ago.